Let's get started. Hi everyone, welcome to the 7th panel in the STEM the Vote series. My name is Tiara and I'm a member of the programming committee on March for Science New York City. A quick intro for those joining us for the first time. March for Science New York City is a nonpartisan group formed by the scientific community, and we stand for 3 core principles. The first being open access of scientific information, the second being science for the common good and preservation of an informed democracy, and for the protection of human and environmental rights. Our gun policy panel today is the 7th in an 8-part series where we learn about different policy issues each week. This series is supported by Science Rising and the Union of Concerned Scientists, and we encourage everyone to visit sciencerising.org and take the Science Rising Challenge. Quick intro to our panelists today before I hand it off to our moderator. We have Igor Volsky today. He's a co-founder and executive director of Guns Down America and author of the book Guns Down: How to Defeat the NRA and Build a Safer Future with Fewer Guns. His previous awards include being featured in Forbes 30 Under 30 in Law and Policy. And we have Kylie Vincent. She's an artist and activist who got started in gun control activism by producing and directing a performance show related to gun control violence with fellow high school students after the Stoneman Douglas high school shooting. And with that, I'll hand it off to our co-chair, Omar Gowayed, to moderate.
Hi everybody, my name is Omar Gowayed. I'm a 5th year PhD candidate in materials chemistry. My specialty is not on guns, it's actually on lasers. So different type of thing that shoots. Different pew pew, I guess. Sorry, I'm too nerdy not to let that joke pass for a gun policy debate. So with that, thank you so much for coming. Thank you for joining us today. To our moderators, thank you. I'm gonna actually, the way we usually structure this panel is that we have a policy expert talk first, and then an activist, and then sort of leave that on to an activist to discuss how their work ties into gun policy and how they affect change in their communities. And if you have any questions at any time, please feel free to put it in the questions. We'll see that and we will answer it in accordance to when it comes up. And you know, if the conversation is really flowing, we'll wait a second and answer it then. So thank you all for coming, and I'll hand it off to Igor to give us a little bit of a background on gun policy.
Well, thank you so much, Omar. Thank you, Tiara. It's great to be here with all of you. Despite telling everybody that I know nothing about science and that I got a D or a C in chemistry, here I am nonetheless. It's good to be with all of you. I'll talk a bit about kind of where we are as a country on the gun issue, some of the policies that folks want to see implemented. I'll touch on the NRA. You may have heard just this past week, they are facing a real serious lawsuit that could result in the dissolution of the entire organization. And then I'll talk a bit about some of the advocacy work my organization, Guns Down America, does. So let's just start with the basics. We're a country with about 40,000 gun deaths every single year. We're a country with about 293 million firearms in civilian hands. That's actually more guns than people. And we're a country where the gun industry, particularly gun manufacturers, are able to, with very limited regulation, produce weapons that are ever more dangerous and that allow civilians to kill large numbers of individuals fairly efficiently. And we are also a country, as you all know, that has more mass shootings than anywhere else on earth, has incredibly high levels of everyday gun violence and has increasing levels, particularly, well, it's been true over the last couple of years, but particularly over the last a couple of months, and I think this trend is going to continue, high rates of suicide, particularly high rates of firearm suicide. The question, of course, is, well, how do we turn the tide? How do we begin building safer communities? How do we do what the rest of the world has really accomplished, particularly our peer nations, and that is begin to bring some of those gun death rates down? The answers are actually fairly simple, and they're fairly simple because almost, again, every other peer nation has been successful. And what they've done is really three different things, or as I like to say, three different buckets of policy. The first looks at really regulating the firearm industry, particularly firearm manufacturers, in a serious way. Right now, very generally speaking, if I'm a gun manufacturer, as long as I'm not producing fully automatic machine guns, which were banned for civilian production in 1986, as long as I'm not doing that, I can pretty much have a wide latitude in terms of the kinds of products I produce. And it's no accident that really beginning in the late 80s to early 90s, you begin to see gun manufacturers pull in some of the military designs they were selling to the military and begin marketing those kinds of powerful weapons. You've all heard of assault weapons. Begin marketing those weapons to civilians. They did that because they needed to figure out, how do we convince people who already have so many guns to buy more of our products? And the answer turned out, because again, this stuff isn't very well regulated, that we're going to make those firearms more deadly. And that's exactly what they did. And so we're now in a situation where, if in the mid-1980s, the most popular kind of gun was a revolver, now it's a semi-automatic pistol that takes a large capacity magazine that allows an individual to just shoot and kill people far more efficiently than just a couple of decades prior. That's a result of a business decision. Oh, and by the way, if a gun manufacturer produces a weapon that's incredibly dangerous, that doesn't have safety features that would make sense, you can't even sue that manufacturer because of a special shield that's been put in place by the US Congress in 2005. And so that's really kind of the first bucket of trying to regulate this industry in a serious way, making sure that the products that they produce actually have safety standards like so many products around the country. The second bucket of policy we all should really think about is dealing with community-based violence. This is the kind of violence that's been on the rise in the last couple of months as we've been living through the COVID pandemic. And what we know about gun violence in major cities is that it's really perpetrated by a very small number of individuals. Really, it's about 0.01% of a population is responsible for the overwhelming amount of everyday gun violence. This is retaliatory gun violence. This is gun violence that's associated maybe with the drug trade in certain communities. But the good news is, and criminologists have done this, is that you're able to identify those small numbers of individuals who are most at risk of both committing gun violence, but also being the victim of gun violence. And once you've identified those individuals, there are things you could do and circumstances you can create to get a direct message to that small number of individuals, that if they continue to perpetuate a cycle of violence, that there's going to be serious consequences, not just from law enforcement really, but from the community as a whole. And you can begin to think about what kinds of opportunities those individuals need in terms of educational enhancement, employment and job opportunities, housing security, healthcare access, to ensure that they have other pathways that don't involve gun violence. And the truth is, there are community programs all around this country. There's different models of programs, everything from cure violence that treats violence as a disease. I think you scientific people would like that. Ceasefire programs that are very similar, that again, apply the pressure of the community to get the folks who are most likely to commit gun violence to stop doing that. And those initiatives that have been really running all across the country since the 1990s in Boston have been linked to reductions in gun violence of anywhere between 30 and 60%. These are programs that are funded by city budgets, sometimes by state budgets. Imagine what could happen if these programs were truly federally funded, the kinds of reductions we would see. And not only would we be tackling gun violence and its consequences directly, but we would also be looking at the underlying root causes of a lot of what plagues society. So bucket 2 really focuses on investing in our communities, investing in the communities that are most impacted by gun violence. And then bucket 3 really deals with enhancing federal laws and regulations when it comes to how easy it is to get a gun. We often talk about background checks, and you, I'm sure, have heard this idea of expanding background checks to every single gun purchase. But there are other policies as well that build on the foundation of a strong background check system for gun purchases, things like gun licensing and gun registration, things like gun buybacks, certainly banning high capacity magazines and assault weapons that so efficiently kill people, tightening gun trafficking laws, because what we often see is guns trafficked from states with loose gun regulations into states with more gun regulation. And so that's why you really want to see a federal solution when it comes to really raising the standard of gun ownership for everybody. And you'll notice that I'm talking about raising the standard, making guns harder to get for everybody, as opposed to what we've heard for decades and decades and decades in our politics, which is this idea that, you know, we really have to keep guns out of the hands of dangerous people, or we have to keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them. Now, if you step back for a second and think about this, I think you quickly realize that there's no way to divide an entire population between good people and responsible gun owners and dangerous people, because you're a responsible gun owner or a good gun owner until you're not, until you pull that trigger. That is true in so many contexts. And I'll also argue that no other country that has solved and lowered their rates of gun violence has tried to divide the population into those two categories. That what they've done is that they've made guns harder to get. They've put in standards that include exhaustive background checks, that include training requirements, that include renewals of gun licenses every couple of years. We have states in this country that have done that, states like New Jersey and Massachusetts that saw decreases of gun violence as a result. So that's what I would really think about in terms of the policies we need on the federal level. But all of these three pillars have to come together in order for us to really think about this issue holistically. And I would argue that the community piece really has to come first. And then let me just quickly talk about the NRA, and then I promise I'll stop.
No, I love it. I was about to thank you. Like, I like the three buckets. I like that you didn't say like, oh, we need to ban all guns or any of that. Like that was actually a very big concern of people who, before they came to our panel discussion. But you know, you talked about the three buckets, how to address issue, the history of the policy, how it, you know, the community aspect, and addressing the roots of the issue as well as addressing access to firearms. You know, this is, yeah, keep going. Like talk to us about that NRA.
Well, you know, banning all firearms is what the NRA always says people like me and Kylie and others want to do. But the reality of the situation is, you know, we are governed by a constitution. That constitution has an amendment that is up to and has been the center of political debate for several decades. But I don't really think, and certainly at least I haven't met folks in our gun violence prevention movement who think about that amendment as something that needs to be repealed. Certainly, maybe it's something that needs to be rethought and reconsidered. But we as a country certainly have a history of firearm ownership. We've used firearms in all kinds of you know, difficult for us to think of now ways, right? First to subjugate African Americans during the slave trade, and then to move westward, which of course took the lives of many Native Americans as we did so. There's a mythology in the United States about the cowboy fighting for American freedom and living out a manifest destiny of expansion. All of these individualistic ideals, that kind of American mythology, is part of the reason why we've really struggled to enact sensible gun violence prevention laws in this country. It's also, I would argue, relatedly, part of the reason why we as a country have really struggled to contain COVID, because there's this resistance to certainly to government interference, but also to think of ourselves as part of the larger community. And in the United States, the National Rifle Association has really succeeded in weaponizing the Second Amendment to make the kinds of arguments that Omar was alluding to, that if you adopt any kind of gun regulation, that's somehow a slippery slope towards complete gun confiscation. And the fact of the matter is that argument is in many ways a real challenge. It's a real challenge because what the NRA has been able to do, and they haven't always argued in this kind of way, this really resulted from an internal revolution in leadership that they had in the late 1960s. And what they recognized is that there is real power towards creating an entire identity around gun ownership. That gun ownership isn't about just having the instrument of a gun, that it's about who you are as an American, that it's an extension of your patriotic identity, that it seeps into so many other parts of your politics, whether they be politics about healthcare or abortion access or the environment or the music you listen to. And the way the NRA and some of the other gun rights organizations have communicated with their members is in that kind of cultural language to really convince people that any kind of gun regulation is an attack on their culture, is a way to chip away at what it is to be an American patriot, and trying to fight against that sense for the gun violence prevention movement has been a real challenge. But what you did see a couple of weeks ago, or 2 weeks ago now, is a lawsuit from the state attorney general in New York. New York is where the NRA is chartered and has been chartered since 1871. In her lawsuit, which really has nothing to do with the kind of political work the NRA does in opposing gun restrictions, but is entirely focused on the mismanagement of NRA funds and NRA dues by the top leaders in the gun lobby. When the lawsuit came out, I very enthusiastically read all 169 pages. And I have to tell you, the kind of corruption and self-dealing that these nonprofit leaders are mixed up with is mind-blowing. I'll give you just one example. They set up the series of sweetheart deals for their top executives, wherein after those individuals retired from the NRA, they would sign contracting agreements that would pay out those individuals so anywhere between $30,000 to $60,000 a month as a consulting fee for those individuals to do nothing at all. In fact, when the investigation first began, and the board began to look into this because a lot of these contracts went around the board, they were shocked to discover through audits they ran that those individuals who were being paid $30,000 to $60,000 a month were producing no work at all for the organization. So that, on top of chartering private planes, having your vacations paid for, having all kinds of insane expenses paid for by your nonprofit institution, is just part of the reason why the lobby is in so much trouble. And so as it deals with this lawsuit, as it deals with the fallout from the lawsuit, there's a real question about what the gun rights movement is going to look like in the United States, who or what other kind of organization is going to take over, and then in turn, how those changes are going to affect any kind of national debate we're able to have about tightening gun laws come January or February if Joe Biden is elected. And then the last thing I'll say, and then I promise I will stop, that a lot of what our organization, Guns Down America, does is really think about chipping away and creating cultural change around the gun issue through non-legislative means. And so we focus on really pushing corporations to lean into gun reform and to be part of the solution towards building safer communities. And we urge Americans to use their power as consumers to push companies like McDonald's, for instance, which is headquartered in Illinois, to invest directly in its own backyard and help fund the kind of community programs that are helping to reduce gun violence in Chicago. So let me stop there. I hope this was helpful, and I very much look forward to your questions.
I very much appreciate it. Like that snaps for that. Very good breakdown. Absolutely love it. I am shocked that they did that as a nonprofit. Like, we, as March for Science New York City, we are a broke nonprofit. We owe ourselves a bit of money. But, you know, to imagine somebody having not only that much money, but that much money to spend on themselves is, you know, as broke grad students, that sounds like magical thinking. But that's the way you lose your nonprofit and lose your mission. Kylie, thank you so much for your patience. You are an activist in the against gun violence and increasing gun violence. You're from a community that survived a mass shooting event. Could you briefly introduce who you are and the work that you do in combating gun violence?
Yeah, so I'll just start with my story and get into what I do today and how everything is relevant right now. So basically, I'm 20 years old, so I was in high school. I was a senior in high school when the Parkland Stoneman Douglas High School shooting happened. And I am from Thousand Oaks, California. And so when that happened, the students of Stoneman Douglas High School did a call to action for all high schools throughout the nation to do walkouts to show not only your support against gun violence and moving forward in communities, how we can prevent it, but also to just stand with the victims. And like, as high schoolers, sitting in those classrooms day to day, being like, when is this going to happen to us? It was kind of enough is enough, which is a big saying with us. And so I started doing that. And what had happened was I was just sitting in my room one night, and this attributes to, you know, how prevalent social media is to our generation. But I was watching all of the videos of the students from Stoneman Douglas. I was watching the videos from the classrooms in the moment that it happened. I was watching the interviews, and I was just absolutely moved to tears, and just thinking about, like, this is someone my age up there, you know, speaking out and having to go through this absolutely traumatic thing. And I had never really like considered myself an activist or involved in politics before. I went to, since Thousand Oaks is outside of LA, I went to things like Women's March and Pride March and all those sorts of things, but I never took this sort of initiative. And the way that I knew best how to combat things with conflict and try to make something out of it was art. I am really into theater. And so I was in high school at the time. So that day, high school administration and being like, I know there's only 1 or 2 months left of school, but I want to put together a fundraiser for March for Our Lives. And I want like poets and dancers and songwriters and scenes that all attribute to how gun violence affects everyone, and just like a call to action in a way that everyone can sit in the theater and no one has to speak at each other, but you can just listen to this like new way of speaking for yourself. And so I had a meeting with them, and my area that I'm from is fairly conservative, and the school is really all for it, but they're like, you can't mention gun control or gun violence or anything. So that was something very interesting that we ran into also with the walkouts, because our first walkout was on campus. They made it a requirement where you also couldn't mention the words gun violence or gun control, and it was just in honoring the victims. And then the second call to action walkout they called out to across the nation, we did, but it had to be off campus, and we all received tardies and detentions, and we couldn't make up our work for that lunch period that we weren't even missing class for. And so that was also kind of beautiful in a way, because I just remember I got to the park across our school early, and I saw just like a march of kids from my school coming towards me, and like no one cared that it was gonna happen, all the like truancies, and a lot of us were seniors, so you know it could affect us walking on graduation. But in the end, I think that was really beautiful, especially in a community where, you know, it is like also predominantly white, and like we don't experience anything like gun violence on a day-to-day basis, you know, in neighborhoods. Like living in New York City, we see it everywhere, and it's a part of people's everyday life. And so that was a really epic way for people to kind of wake up, but there's also such a high percentage that we're still like very against it. And that's why I found like theater and art to be extremely helpful and a useful tool, because it's like you sit in a room and no one's talking at each other, and you can just communicate in this beautiful way. And then so I moved to New York City to continue my artistic path, and then also activism. And out there, I moved out there, and I want to say like 3 months later, my hometown had its shooting, which was at Borderline Bar and Grill. It's an 18 plus venue where you can like have food and drinks and country line dance. And actually it's very interesting. They reported on it on the news as like a club, it's like in a suburban area. It's very strange because it's like a country bar, but you know, like me and my friends, we'd do that all when we turned 18. Like everyone went on the dance floor, and it was just this crazy thing where I was already involved in this movement that was also highly criticized by the high percentage of people that were very conservative and pro-Trump and pro-gun. And then it's those people lost their sons and daughters. And then in addition, like you see the videos rolling, and those are the floors, you know, and it's just, it was really crazy to try and address that, because one thing that I truly like want to work on with any type of movement, especially this one because it's so polarizing, is like Igor was saying, we're not an anti-gun, like we're not trying to rip people's amendment away. I'm all for people with guns if they're safe gun owners and believe in common sense gun laws, and like we'll go over that. But it was an interesting thing where you see that perspective too, where you see students' faces that you knew being like represented at a protest, and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't tell what the difference is of exploitation and what is bringing someone to wake up and realize that this is really scary. So I'm actually, it's a terrible thing, but I'm also glad that I got to see the side of, you know, seeing the things that are wrong with activism and like understanding that and acknowledging it, because it is, when it's a personal cause, it's really hard to swallow at times. And that's why I continued to do theatrical and artistic events, because if you get everyone in a room with each other and you're just presenting like this thing that evokes emotion out of you, we can all come to agree that we don't want to lose anyone's life, you know? We all might have different political opinions, but we can all agree on something, that we don't want to lose our children, aunts, uncles, etc. So that's where my story and kind of what I do. And I could talk about this more if anyone wants to hear about it, but I worked with, in New York, Tectonic Theater Company. They also did the Laramie Project, if anyone's familiar. They do like divisive activism type plays. That one was about a gay kid from his hometown that got killed as a hate crime. And then we were working on gun violence, gun control activists all throughout the nation. And I got to like go to Penn State and work with students there. And you bring stories from everywhere you go. So you even put the play in wherever you are. So if you're at Penn State or if you're at Washington University, you put it, people's stories from there as well. So I see that there's some questions. Should I answer those or?
So the questions right now, actually, I want to table them because there's one more topic that both of you have touched on that I will. And I'll get to the questions right after that. And I promise I read the questions from you, James and Gary, and we'll get to them. But both of you have touched on racism, bias, sexism, homophobia, and gun violence. You know, and you know, you briefly touched on this, Igor, with respect to police violence. And it's the concept is, you know, you have people such as Philando Castile who was murdered, you know, did everything he could do to become a, you know, legal, proper gun owner, identified that he had a gun to the police and was still gunned down. Or Ahmaud Arbery, who was murdered by essentially what is the remnants of a lynching law in Georgia. You know, you have, you know, the concept of gun violence against in race and how racism ties into gun violence, and even like how racism ties into the gun lobby with respect to the NRA and how they strongly supported, you know, banning certain weapons or access to certain weapons when the Black Panther Party marched with, you know, had an armed march. So like this question of race and firearms and violence with respect to race and firearms, this violence with respect to the police and race and firearms. If you could, both of you, if you can, you know, talk a little bit more about that. Kylie, from the, you know, if you can expand a little bit more on the theatrical presentation of this and how it was used, you know, from both of you would be great.
Yeah.
Kylie, I'll let you go first. Seeing that last time Igor went first, and then we'll let Igor go for it.
Yeah, that's an awesome thing to address too, because being with March for Our Lives, I was the state action director in New York, and one of the things that March for Our Lives has done wrong in the past and also has had trouble getting there, because they were started as an organization based off of their high school shooting, and those kids came together and created this organization. And then ended up getting a lot of flack because their focuses were these like mass shootings at high schools, and like particularly not intentionally, but white high schools. And people were like, hey, this actually happens every day in my neighborhood, or like kids have guns on my campus every day. And so how it was kind of first unintentionally ignored through the movement that came up with Parkland was really important to note, because, you know, even activists who are trying to do the right thing just didn't have that perspective and needed to be reminded of it. And when I went for the Here To project, the device to play about gun control activists, they brought a story from a Penn State student, and he had some mental illness issues, and his dad, he was a Penn State student on campus, and his dad did a mental health call for him, and then they shot and killed him. And he was not violent, he was just having an episode. They claimed he had like a knife. There was evidence that it was like a butter knife, and obviously racism played into it, and just all of the systemic things that happen, where it's also like, why wasn't there a mental health counselor there? And you know, that might have not happened, or might definitely have not happened if it was a white student. And so I think obviously that plays into it really largely. And even if it's not high school shootings, but like even when I moved up to, I first lived in Uptown when I moved to New York City, and just like everyone's like, New York City is a melting pot. But I was like, but everyone up happen as you go more up, and like people have to deal with it day to day. So that's my thoughts on that.
Thank you. Igor, race, violence, and policing.
Well, you know, we live in a racist country, and it's to me actually refreshing that now as a nation we're trying to tackle this problem, and frankly, the gun control movement is also trying to tackle this problem. I appreciate Kylie saying that initially the March for Our Lives movement or some of the Parkland students really had a hard time adjusting to criticism that they were receiving that Kylie outlined about the focus really being on all white or majority white schools and the school shootings that take place there. But that's not unusual. That's been the case with our movement for a very long time. When I really began working on this issue in a serious way in 2016, we never talked about everyday gun violence, or we didn't focus, certainly not on police violence, not on police brutality, and not on the kind of violence that happens in some of our major cities. The fact that we're having those conversations now, I actually think in large part is a reflection of what the Parkland students learned as they began to do this work. The fact that by the time they went on their summer tour, which was, I guess, now 2 summers ago or 3 summers ago or whatever it was, that they were really passing the mic to community members from Black and brown communities who live and are closest to the pain of everyday gun violence. And it's no exaggeration to say that it was that act and that recognition from those young people that really helped push our entire movement to prioritize community violence. And I'll also say that, you know, as we think about creating a space for actual legislative change, if there's a change in government on the federal level in January, that I think many of our colleagues in the movement will recognize the importance of taking a public health approach to gun violence prevention, and to avoid some of the painful mistakes in the past that focused on really criminalizing the end user of that gun, as opposed to really tackling the issue at its root causes and recognizing that the cause of a lot of the gun violence we live with is simply the purposeful under-resourcing of communities. I'll say one more thing about the conversation we're having around police and how it relates to the gun violence problem. If it's true that even the most highly trained individuals to whom we give guns as part of their job, right, are not immune from the racial history of this country, from many of the racist systems and policies of this country, and use those firearms to perpetuate and create incredible racist disparities in how they conduct their job as law enforcement officers and how they use their firearms as law enforcement officers, then it also follows that the same is true for everyday individuals who don't have the responsibility of a law enforcement official, don't have the training when it comes to using the firearm of a law enforcement official. And so I would argue that as we have this conversation about restructuring the police or defunding the police or reimagining the police or however you want to say it, that it's so incredibly important for us to have a more expansive conversation about the role of firearms in our society, about the loose gun laws in our society. Because if you want to think about taking pieces of police budget and giving and appropriating those dollars to other kinds of city services, whether they be healthcare interventions, right, that don't require a gun, or some other kinds of interventions that law enforcement currently does, but we don't think law enforcement has the skills to do. That it's hard for us to think about shifting those funds, sending other folks to respond to maybe non-life-threatening emergency situations in a country that, again, has more guns than people. And because we don't have any kind of registry, we have no idea where those guns are. So to me, the police conversation that we're currently having, that we really had in the months of June and July, is an incredible first step into recognizing that police violence is gun violence. And in order for us to be successful and to keep communities safe, we really have to tackle both of those things simultaneously.
Thank you to both of you, and then also thank you for acknowledging how race plays into the movement and challenges in overcoming racism within the movement. I mean, this is something that exists, as scientists, we're setting up racial justice and inclusion initiatives in our departments. We are, it's a very common thing to think critically about race within our communities and within our movements, and it takes a lot of critical thought. So with that, seeing that we have 15 minutes left, I think we should give some time to the questions. So first question asked is from Gary, and it relates actually to mental health, but it's more specifically on the roles of healthcare with respect to gun violence. And so can you talk a little bit about healthcare and mental health, the misconceptions? I remember reading a paper that people who suffer from mental health issues are actually the most affected by gun violence, and not necessarily are the ones causing the gun violence, as well as the role of healthcare in the violence community and the intersection of the two. And I'll leave it to whoever wants to go first for this one.
I'll go quickly. I spent the first part of my career working on improving healthcare access and helping craft and ultimately pass what became the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, or whatever you want to call it. And so, to me, access to healthcare is really one of the innate rights we all have as humans. And it's really a travesty that it took until 2010 for us to get somewhat closer to having universal health care. And of course, the individuals who often point to mental health care as the real, or mental care as the real problem in our gun violence, larger gun violence context, are the same lawmakers who not only voted against expanding access to healthcare, but then voted repeatedly 30, 40, 50 times to repeal that law and take away that healthcare, not only the mental health parity that's in the law, but also, of course, the physiological healthcare as well. So, you know, I will also just say that Omar is right, that the science tells us that there's a very, very poor link between, or there's very little research, I should say, to substantiate this argument that individuals who carry out gun violence are crazy or have a mental health problem. It's about 3%, I think the number is, of individuals who have some kind of diagnosable mental health condition that are linked to gun violence. And then the truth is, as Omar was saying, that people with serious mental health challenges are actually far more likely to be victims of gun violence than to be perpetrators of gun violence. That being said, certainly when you look at how our suicide numbers are going up, when you recognize that about 60% of gun violence in the United States are suicides, it's incredibly important for everybody in this country to have access to healthcare, which includes access to mental health care. And so I certainly think that having equitable access to affordable health care will help reduce some of our gun deaths, particularly on the suicide piece. But don't let anybody tell you that what we really need to do is worry about all those crazy people or all those people with mental health conditions, because they're the ones that are responsible for the gun violence. It's just not true. That only goes to stigmatize those populations. And so I argue that, again, we can chew gum and walk or talk or whatever at the same time, and we need to tackle both of these problems.
I just wanted to say as well, I know particularly for the borderline shooting, it was a veteran who was the shooter that suffered from PTSD. And I think although it is like a smaller portion in the gun violence statistics recently, that plays a huge role, even if there isn't gun violence involved, is veterans receiving health care for things like PTSD that most of the time are never even diagnosed, because it's just like you were saying about stigmatizing things. It is that, and it's just under cared for. And so there are like exceptions or instances when that is like, there is a root of a problem there too, with that has to specifically do with PTSD. But I also think people do stigmatize, saying like, oh, that person was mentally ill who did gun violence. And people who are mentally ill can be anywhere from, you know, minor depression to manic bipolar disorder to borderline personality type of thing. So it's really interesting how that's used in the conversation of gun violence, because most of our population is mentally ill in some way, with forms of depression and anxiety, especially like our recent comings of generations with social media and everything. Like, we all have a form of mental illness.
And thank you both for elucidating it, and definitely, you know, it is negligible, and we do have to address our healthcare and make sure that, you know, March for Science isn't necessarily on the side of affordable. We're on the side of free healthcare, seeing that evidence-based policy. This stipulates a single-payer healthcare does save 70,000 lives per year and billions of dollars per year, and we're very much on the side of making sure we don't let people die. So James has a question for you, actually, Igor, specifically, about what happens when the NRA gets dissolved in New York. Can they just reconstitute somewhere else, or do they have to wait until the lawsuit runs its course? It could happen beforehand, and then we can move on to Mike's question.
Yeah, I think that they will have to wait for the lawsuit to resolve itself. And so, this will take years. And so they will be in this limbo for that period of time. They're not able to just tomorrow get up and reconstitute themselves in Texas. But again, we'll see how they react, and if their members actually object to and start to maybe leave the organization, given all of the allegations that have come out.
So I guess this is a question. I'm sure both of you are familiar with the Dickey Amendment and research with respect to gun violence. So the question is actually about, how do you research gun violence while allowing a responsible gun ownership? I know the question doesn't specifically say Dickey Amendment, but I think a brief history of the Dickey Amendment, current status of gun research and what could be done if we have this, if we allow for unfettered access to gun research.
I read up on this before signing on here because I thought you scientists would ask. So a little history, there was this congressman by the name of, I forgot his first name, last name Dickey. In 1996, I believe, he originated a rider that prevented, for the most part, the federal government, CDC, NIH, others, from researching gun violence. It was presented under the guise that the government should not be funding research to study gun control. But of course, it then covered almost all gun research. And so as a result, there's very limited government funding. And most of the research that's been done on suicide prevention, trying to understand what works best, trying to understand what kind of gun control policies work best, for instance, has been either funded by institutions or private philanthropies or other means. And it's really made it difficult for us to fully grasp this problem. In 2018, the House passed a measure that was attached to a defense bill that for the first time pushed the Secretary of Health and Human Services to recognize that there's a place for the government to fund research around gun violence. And then in December of 2019, the Congress appropriated about $25 million to research to the CDC and to NIH to begin studying gun violence. Now, we're in a place where there is now going to be some government-funded research into gun violence, but the Dickey Amendment is still very much in place. And so there's somewhat more of a balance here, but of course, we would want to see, and I think all organizations and advocates in this space would want a full repeal of the Dickey Amendment and really robust research funded by the government and performed by some of our best scientists into understanding, again, the nature and the scope of our problem, getting a sense of what kind of intervention policies actually work to reduce certainly suicides and other kinds of gun violence. As you may know, if you look at the party platform, since we are in a political year, but you guys are not political, I will note that certainly Vice President Biden, Senator Harris do support robust research into gun violence and eliminating those riders, and the president in his reelection does not.
We are political. We're nonpartisan.
That's right.
Our view is we're not, and we're also not bipartisan. That's very critical. We don't care for either party. Our main focus is evidence-based policy. Like Medicare for all is not on the Democrats' policy, and climate change. We're very pro Green New Deal and whatnot. And so for our view is wherever the evidence goes, we go. Two fun facts about the NRA or about the Dickey Amendment. The NRA, when they initially lobbied for the Dickey Amendment, they actually tried to dissolve the harm reduction section of the CDC. So they actually tried to dissolve an entire department of the CDC that was doing research because they published a paper that was about gun violence. And instead, because that didn't work out, they specifically went on this. Currently, it stipulates that you're not allowed to have, after the 2018 reform, you're not allowed to make policy recommendations with this research that's being funded now by the government. Which, and some people might say, oh, well, it makes sense. If they're funded, they shouldn't have policy recommendations. But this is just, juxtapose this to anything else. Like imagine Fauci not being allowed to make policy recommendations about COVID. Imagine people from NASA not being allowed to make policy recommendations about climate change. It's completely antithetical to government-funded research, especially with government-funded research with respect to policy, for scientists not to be allowed to make policy recommendations to scientists based off of their research. Kylie, and then we'll get on to the last question, and then we'll hand it off to Tiara. And any other questions, we'll have. Please send it to us in an email. We'll try to get out to you. Kylie, all yours.
I was just gonna say.
I'm sorry, Kylie, you're breaking up a little bit.
Yeah. Everything basically I was gonna say. So I was looking at the next question. So whenever you're ready, I could. Hello.
Okay, you're done breaking up. Welcome back.
Okay.
You said
Okay,
what
thank
we
you.
heard was in a very broken up fashion that you're looking at the next question, and so you're ready for the next question. All right, so
Yes.
Igor, you touched on this briefly already with how the U.S. defense spending affects the military-industrial complex and how does it impact the gun violence movement and like gun violence in the USA and the anti-gun violence movement. So Kylie, we'll hand it off to you first, and then Igor, you can wrap us up, and we'll hand it off to Tiara to say goodbye.
Yeah. I just wanted to the funding part, but I can let Igor, just because we haven't touched on the relevance of COVID and the protests of how that was affecting. But they mentioned the spending boosting of the military. I was thinking, the first time I read that, I was thinking about the protests and how it's very militant and every one of them was armed. And I think because if we've all been like keeping up on the gun sales during COVID and how up they've gone, with this America is looking and on the streets with kind of a type of militant, it's given, first of all, kind of being swept away because things like mass shootings and school shootings haven't been happening since we were in quarantine, but everyone is trying to buy weapons because of the world ending crisis. And I think that just goes to show when you have like this visual of militant type of police officers on the streets, and that is what your government is putting there for you, and you should be scared and there's no more toilet. It's really interesting how COVID and how even if we are still all inside and not in public places together, gun violence will still occur because there's like this panic method that our current administration has given the civilians, as if we're not like all here together, but there is a side that is against you and you shouldn't protest and yada yada yada. And then just like pitted against your neighbors as well, because we're not going through a pandemic together for, like I was saying, like resources to think of, and that's how I think gun violence is playing into it right now, even though most people's lives are not happening.
That's a very interesting juxtaposition. You answered two questions in one. You know, basically how the COVID pandemic ties into people buying more weapons, although it was found that survival modes weren't with weapons purchases, but with you know, knowing your community and knowing what, and thinking community centered, you know, thinking how can I give aid to my community, where can I receive aid from my community, you know, who has the vertical farm or who has the urban farm was something that, you know, in the beginning of the crisis when we had food shortages in New York, we really focused on. Another aspect that you covered is, you know, the armed demonstrations of the anti-healthcare groups that would take over state capitals to try to intimidate lawmakers into not passing healthcare resolutions and you know, COVID policies and COVID prevention policies, which was an interesting, that was not expected. I didn't expect, I know there's an anti-vaxxer movement, but I didn't expect an armed armed pro-pandemic movement. With that, Igor, I'll let you wrap us up with the fact the military-industrial complex and how that ties into arms proliferation amongst the civilian population.
Well, I'll say three things. One is there's the piece about military equipment moving into our police forces, which really began in the 1960s in a serious way, and we see the consequences of that now, sadly, on our streets. We see the consequences of gun manufacturers pulling in military designs, selling those designs into the civilian market, and really increasing the lethality of our, certainly our mass shooting events, but also our instances of everyday gun violence. The weapons are just so much more powerful. And then the third thing I'll say, and this will open up a whole other can of worms, so I'll be very brief, is that there's a real strain within the pro-gun movement that is entirely dominant, that is centered on this theory of insurrectionism, that I should have a firearm, I should have the most powerful firearm, and I should have all kinds of military garb because I, as an individual, need to stand up against the potentially tyrannical government, and I, as an individual, need to overthrow that government. That is a theory that is entirely pervasive within the gun rights movement and is entirely pervasive within the politicians who find their constituency in that movement. And as Kylie was saying, not only are we seeing instances of armed intimidation at the Reopen rallies that we saw in April and May, at the George Floyd protests in June, we counted within 1 month, within the month of June, 60 separate instances of white nationalists showing up at these rallies all across the country. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with the conversation going on now about Facebook and the kind of platform Facebook and other digital companies provide to extremists, allowing them to organize and allowing them to then push their hate off of the platform into the real world. That is a massive problem in the United States. There are just thousands and thousands and thousands of people in America who are armed to the teeth with the strongest weapons imaginable, who literally want to overthrow the US government to create a second civil war in the United States. Some of these folks are inspired by racism. Others are inspired by libertarian ideology. And that's a real danger. It's a real danger at a time when the president gives such platform to these individuals and talks about, you know, Second Amendment remedies and protecting Second Amendment rights. That's what he's signaling, that kind of approach to gun ownership, this insurrectionist approach, is valid. You know, we saw just a couple of weeks ago an election of an individual who's a QAnon conspiracy theorist. There are dozens of Republicans who could win their general election races, having the most extreme conspiracy-minded set of beliefs that we have ever seen as a nation. And as a result, particularly as the NRA is weakening and some of its competitors in the gun rights space who are even more extreme than the NRA, if they can take hold, that marriage between a more extreme gun rights movement and lawmakers in Congress who reflect those views can move the Republican Party even further to the right on guns. And that's a real danger, frankly, that we face as a country, particularly as we barrel towards an election that the president keeps saying is illegitimate, keeps saying is rigged. In 2016, he specifically asked his base to act as poll watchers to make sure the election wasn't rigged when people went to polling places to vote in 2016. Here, his rhetoric in 2020 is even more alarmist and could become even more alarmist and activate individuals who have a lot of firepower. So on that troubling note, I thank you all for listening and thank you for your time.
Yeah, and ended on the rise of fascism. That's so lovely. As someone who's seen a revolution, in Egypt, I will say that weapons find their way to, when people need weapons, they find weapons. And weapons don't make the revolution. It's people coming together as a community really do make a revolution more than anything else. But when people need to defend themselves, there's an anecdotal story that Egyptians tell each other of the local arms dealer distributing arms when government thugs were basically walking through the streets trying to intimidate people back in the streets, of your local arms dealer passing out weapons to people and people returning the guns when the crisis was over, and to set up self-protection and stuff like that. So from the perspective of insurrection and revolution, remember, your community is who has your back more than anything. It's not, your community and what they have as tools will be your best friend when time gets rough, as we saw in the pandemic. Take care of your community, make sure that your community is doing well. With that, unfortunately, Tiara, who's supposed to sign us off, has a lot of construction in her neighborhood, so I'm not going to invite her back on to sign us off. But thank you so much, Igor and Kylie. Both of you were amazing today. It was a great conversation. Hopefully, whoever watches it can learn something from the both of you and can, and if you have any questions, please feel free to hit us up. We're March for Science in New York City. And with that, I would like to say our next policy discussion, we'll discuss education policy. It will happen next week. Stay tuned. We're looking forward to seeing you and hearing your questions then and there. And this will be loaded up to our YouTube if you want to rewatch any sections. Thank you so much to all of you. Thank you again, Kylie and Igor. Thank you, Tiara, for the introductions. Thank you, Science Rising, for the funding. And thank you, of course, to all our attendees. Have a great night.
Everybody, bye-bye.